Welcome, sleepy traveler. You've arrived at a quiet space made just for you. My name is Valarie, and I am here to guide you gently into rest, to help ease your mind, soften your body, and drift you toward a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. Whether your day was long or your thoughts feel a little too loud tonight, let this be your permission to slow down, to breathe, and to simply be. There's nothing more to do now. Just allow my voice to be your guide as we begin this gentle journey toward deep, nourishing rest. If you're new here, subscribe for sleep content like this, and like this video if you find it enjoyable. Let's begin. Take in a slow, gentle breath through your nose. Feel the air glide down into your lungs, filling you with soft, quiet energy. Pause for a moment at the top of your breath. And now release it slowly through your mouth, letting the day fall away with your exhale. Notice how even this single breath brings a touch of calm to your body. This is your time, a pocket of stillness carved just for you. The world outside can wait. Right now, you are safe, held, and invited to rest deeply. Feel your eyes soften, your jaw unclench, your shoulders drop with relief. The weight of the day begins to melt from your body like snow under the first touch of sunlight. Let your attention drift to the crown of your head. Imagine a soft, golden warmth gathering there like a gentle morning glow. This warmth is calm and kind, and it slowly begins to flow downward. It brushes over your forehead, smoothing away any lingering thoughts. Any tension or worry you carried here tonight begins to fade with every slow exhale. Your mind feels spacious, quiet, and safe. The warmth drifts to your eyes now. Your eyelids grow heavy, cradled by the calm surrounding you. You may notice tiny muscles around your eyes softening, relaxing fully. Your face is a canvas now, free of strain, painted only with peace. Let this comforting glow trace your cheeks, your lips, your chin. Your lips part slightly, effortless and soft. Your tongue rests gently in your mouth, and you no longer need to hold anything. Now the warmth flows into your neck and shoulders. They have carried so much today, but here, in this moment, they are weightless. With each exhale, imagine your shoulders sinking deeper into your bed or cushion, completely supported. The tension dissolves like mist, leaving behind only lightness. Your arms now feel the gentle wave of calm. It travels down to your elbows, your forearms, all the way to your fingertips. Each finger unwinds its quiet grip on the day. Your hands are soft and heavy, as though floating in warm water. Bring your attention to your chest. Feel the rhythm of your breathing, slow, natural, effortless. With each inhale, you receive calm. With each exhale, you release anything you no longer need to carry. Your heartbeat is steady, a soft drum in the distance. It reminds you of the quiet, constant life within you. And with every beat, you are sinking deeper into safety and stillness. Now let this warmth pool in your stomach and lower back. Any tension here softens under the glow of your own awareness. As you breathe out, imagine tiny knots loosening, unwinding, and disappearing. Your hips relax next, spreading calm into your thighs. Your legs grow heavier, like they are being cradled by the earth itself. Feel it moving through your knees, your calves, and your ankles. Finally, it reaches your feet, softening each toe, releasing every last bit of effort. Your entire body is now a vessel of warmth, heavy and light all at once. Wrapped in a cocoon of safety, you are ready to drift into the deepest rest. Imagine now that you are lying on a soft, grassy hill beneath a sky sprinkled with stars. The night air is cool and comforting, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. A gentle breeze brushes across your skin, tender as a lullaby. Each star above you twinkles like a tiny lantern, lighting the path to your dreams. You feel weightless, floating in this moment. There is no time here, no rush, only the vastness of calm around you. Even your thoughts seem softer now, like clouds passing quietly through the night sky. If they drift in, they drift out just as easily, leaving only space for rest. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the soft trickle of water. Perhaps it is a small stream winding through the hill below you. Or maybe it's the gentle rhythm of your own breath, echoing like a song of the earth. This sound guides you deeper into the warmth of your body, the softness of the moment. You are floating now, weightless, timeless, free. Each breath carries you further into the embrace of sleep. Allow your mind to wander toward dreams. They wait for you like friends with open arms. You are safe to let go, to surrender fully to this quiet night. If there are any last threads of wakefulness, release them now. They fall away gently, leaving only peace behind. Your body, mind, and heart are ready to rest. Drift softly. Sleep deeply. And enjoy tonight's bedtime story. I didn't come to Renford for a miracle, but the first morning the bell rang, it sounded like my name. I sat up before my phone's alarm could fizz and fail me. My new bedroom, still half-boxed and paper-lined, glowed in a patient kind of gray that promised good light if I waited. Somewhere above the rooftops a note chimed, clear, bright, no clockwork hurry in it. It was the kind of bell I thought only existed in movies, the kind meant to summon you to a beginning you didn't know you were ready for. I swung my legs to the floor, toes curling against the worn rug I found in the thrift shop on Renford Lane, and waited for a second chime. It came a beat later, then another, spaced like heartbeats, as if the town itself had decided to inhale together. I went to the window. The street outside my little rental, stone-fronted, ivy-clutched, was waking gently. Doors opened. Neighbors stepped out, careful with the chill, some with shawls, some with cardigans buttoned askew. Nearly all carried mugs. They moved uphill toward the town square like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They weren't rushing. They weren't even walking with intention exactly. They were meandering there, the way a habit guides a body without the body resisting. I pulled on yesterday's sweater and slipped my notebook into the pocket out of instinct. I could say it was because I'm a writer, that I never leave without paper. But the real reason was simpler. In the city, if I forgot it, I was punished by a day of composing sentences in my head with nowhere to put them. In Renford, I promised myself, I would write less frantically and more honestly. I would become someone who didn't have to capture everything to survive. On the street, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and something like lemon peel. The bell obliged me with a fourth and fifth chime as I joined the slow parade. An older man ahead of me looked over his shoulder and nodded once, a greeting that took no energy but gave me the strange permission to keep going. The square unveiled itself as I reached the top of the lane, a neat cobbled circle with a glossy old sycamore at its center, and modest shops in soft colors around the edges. Baskets of pansies swung beside doorways. Someone had chalked a hopscotch board near the bakery, and by the base of the sycamore a little tea cart waited like a friend always on time. Behind it stood Mrs. Pemberley, according to the painted sign at the cart's edge, which read, "Pemberley's morning pour. Your first cup is a beginning." She was compact and wry-looking, with hair the color of storm clouds, and a blue shawl that matched the enamel kettle in her hands. Steam curled from it like a ribbon. "New?" she said, pouring tea into a mug I hadn't noticed she'd already picked up for me. I wasn't going to ask how she knew. In a small town, there are 100 ways to tell. "Charity," I said. I moved into the brownstone on Mill End, next to the bakery. "I know the one. The windows stick when it rains." She slid the mug over. "Welcome, Charity from Mill End. Lemon, honey, cream?" "Just lemon," I said, though I'm not sure why. Maybe because the air already smelled like it, or because I hadn't had lemon in my tea since childhood and wanted, suddenly, to remember something softer. The bell chimed again. People settled into the square's edges, perching on the low stone wall around the sycamore's roots, leaning against window frames, sitting cross-legged on the cobbles without fuss. Some greeted each other by name, some by a simple, contented hum. The morning conversations began in that hush that knows it doesn't need to perform. I heard snippets, a comment about the frost on the cabbages, a note on a grandchild's visit, a reminder to save seed for the community garden, laughter that didn't push itself. I sat on the stone wall, mug warming my palms. A woman with a wool hat and a muzzle of freckles smiled toward me as if we were already old friends and said, "You'll sleep better once you're used to the bell. The first week it will wake you. Then it becomes—" She fished for a word with a small flick of her hand. "Thread," offered the man beside her, who had a soft beard and a t-shirt with a cartoon carrot on it. "You don't notice a thread holding you together until someone snips it." "Thread," the woman agreed. "I'm Ruth. That's my husband, Theo. Charity, I said again, practicing the way my name felt here. I've always liked it and also been burdened by it, as if I'm required to be generous at cost to myself. The bell chimed once more, and people rumbled in happy acknowledgement. I sipped my tea. It tasted exactly like the air smelled, lemon and something green, like mint, but not mint. A handful of tiny cakes sat under a glass dome on the cart and were offered around on a napkin as if they were a blessing. I forgot for a moment that I'd been a person who, for the last 5 years, fell asleep with my laptop open and woke with my teeth clenched, who measured days by deadlines and nights by what I failed to finish. Here the measure seemed to be, did you come? Did you bring your mug? Did you listen? Who rings the bell? I asked, finally, because curiosity is a muscle I've never learned to let atrophy, and because the sound threaded through me like a story's first line. I expected a name. I expected a pointing finger toward a belfry tucked behind the green grocery, a mention of the tower I'd somehow missed, a teenager who got up early for extra pocket money. But Ruth only shrugged with a lightness that verged on shrugging and smiling at once. "It's always been there," she said. Theo nodded, sipping. The bell rings, we gather, or we don't. Sometimes I sleep through and somehow I still feel like I made it. Silly, isn't it? "It's always been there," echoed an older woman on my other side, passing me a cake from the napkin platter. "Almond, eat while you ask questions. That's my system." "Thank you," I said, and then, "For how long?" She raised an eyebrow as if I'd asked how long a river had been wet. "As far back as I knew my mother's hands," she said, and popped a piece of the almond cake into her mouth. "Longer." I looked up, trying to see the bell. The sycamore had a dozen birdhouses in its branches, painted and patched, some shaped like cottages with tiny doors, one like a sunflower with a seed-filled porch. The sky wore an early blue, no tower, no steeple, no neat explanation, parked in plain view, waiting to be claimed. "Is it always so?" I tried, searching for a word that wasn't ceremonial, which felt too heavy. "So gentle?" Ruth and Theo considered this. Theo said, "Mostly. During the floods 3 summers ago it was necessary." "And once," Ruth added, "once it was celebratory in a way I'll never forget. But mostly it's what you see. A beginning every day, even if nothing is planned." "Especially if nothing is planned," Mrs. Pemberley called from the cart without looking up, because the line of neighbors had grown, and she had perfected the art of pouring tea and listening at the same time. "That's the whole point, isn't it? People think they need an occasion. An occasion is a bell." I wanted to ask more questions, the kind of ruthless follow-ups I used to use in interviews, the kind that would push people until they gave me something to write down. I didn't. The square was full of a kind of consent I didn't want to break. The consent to let a mystery be an ordinary part of the morning. My notebook remained in my pocket. The bell's last chime was softer, as if waved from a distant room. People stretched, a few kissed cheeks, coats were shucked. Ruth wrapped her scarf twice and said, "The bakery does a honey bun that is actually illegal, I think, if you believe in laws about how happy a person can be Monday through Thursday. Come." We crossed the square together. The bakery's door chimed, a bell with a different voice, and a gust of warm air begged us inside. The counter had a little card propped on it. "We are Renford Bread and Book. Leave a used book, take a book, or write your favorite sentence on a card and tuck it in our jar. Bread is daily. Stories are forever." There was a jar fat with index cards. My throat tightened with something like homesickness for a place I hadn't yet earned the right to miss. While Ruth ordered, Theo pointed to the cards. "I add one every week," he said. "Mostly sentences about radishes." He smiled at my expression. "I run the produce stand." "Ah," I said, "hence the carrot." He looked pleased. We always think we're hiding, and then our t-shirts out us. We carried our pastries back to the square. People were drifting home now, lids on mugs, dogs behaving like someone had explained the rules of mourning to them and they were eager to comply. Mrs. Pemberley rolled her cart a foot to the left to sweep beneath it, then right again. The sycamore's leaves clicked quietly. It might have been the easiest hour I'd spent in years. "I suppose I'll start," I said, though I didn't know at what. I had left freelancing with a collection of articles that read more like apologies than revelations and 2 half-finished book proposals that made me nauseous to open. I had told friends, I just need a quieter town, and myself, I need a new story. Not yet admitting that the old story, prove yourself until you disappear, had eaten me alive and burped. Ruth finished her honey bun and licked the sugar from her thumb without shame. "Please do, start. Most people wait for permission, and I'm telling you now, you can start." She pointed at my pocket. "Is that a notebook?" "It is," I said, tugging it free, its corners softened by a life of being stuffed into bags with chargers and receipts. "Then you're already halfway through beginning," she said. "See? Not so hard." I smiled down at the blank page like it had been personally kind to me. Across the square, a crew was folding up 2 card tables with a quiet efficiency. One had held a chessboard. The other, I realized with a huff of delight, had been hosting an open notebook where people had been writing a collective poem. A little card said, "Add a line if your tea asks you to." I hadn't even noticed. The question I meant to ask about the bell lingered. I pressed it down, tried to shape it into a line for the collective poem. Who rings the bell? Everyone? No one? The town itself? The question answered itself and refused all answers at once. The same way grief did, the same way starting over did. Back home, the bell's echo still threaded my rooms. The windows did stick when I tried to open them, but after a gentle shoulder and a muttered plea, they surrendered. The view looked toward the square's edge, and beyond it, the blue blur of the hills that held Renford like a palm. I set my notebook on the kitchen table. I brewed more tea because it felt like the sort of morning that could withstand seconds. On impulse, I took an index card from my desk and wrote the first sentence that came to me. The bell is a beginning, even if you never mean to begin. I didn't know for what. Story, essay, love letter to a town. But as I wrote it, my breath smoothed. I unpacked the box labeled Office until I found my old metal file holder dented at the corner. In the city, it had been a shrine to shoulds. Today, I decided it would hold only coulds. I wrote titles on fresh manila folders. Essays, Renford portraits, tea-cart interviews, found sentences, bell. The last one I slid to the very front like a dare. It rained mid-morning, a light rain that made everything look as if it had been freshly washed. I put on my coat and walked down to the library, which was somehow both larger and smaller than I expected. Larger in the number of lives contained therein, smaller in square footage. The librarian had a nameplate that read, Mavis, she, her, ask me about moths. I wanted to ask her about both moths and bells, but checked out a book of essays instead, as if to prove I still knew how to carry words home. On my way back, I listened for the bell. It didn't ring. Of course it didn't. It knew when to be quiet. In my apartment, I read on the couch until I fell asleep with the book on my chest and the window open the width of a hand. When the afternoon light turned into evening, I woke to the soft percussion of rain on the sill and the memory of almond cakes. I heated soup and wrote a little, the way you stretch after you've been sitting too long and remember you have muscles. The next morning, it was the bell that woke me again. I smiled into my pillow at the monotone beep of my phone, thinking it had a say. It didn't, not anymore. Once more I stepped into yesterday's sweater. Outside, the air had been warmed by the rain, but not dramatically. It was still early spring and took its time with warmth. Neighbors walked with their mugs. A teenager skateboarding without sound, just a soft skim. Held a thermos under one arm and offered it to his mother with the other. A man in a long wool coat carried a sleeping baby wearing a tiny knitted hat with bare ears. The bare ears winked with each step. At the tea cart, Mrs. Pemberley didn't need to ask my preferences. "Lemon," she said, "and something new." She squeezed a drop of something, not honey, not cream, into my mug and gave it a stir. "Time," she said, "for courage in small doses. We need not be heroic before breakfast." "Good," I said. "I don't think I have that in me anymore." "You'd be surprised what you have in you still," she replied. eyes gone soft. We all think the worst thing that happens takes the best things with it. She handed me the mug. But sorrow hasn't learned to pry open every cupboard. I didn't ask how she knew I had a worst thing. Renford had a way of assuming your life had both edges and soft parts. It didn't change its behavior based on which you brought with you this morning. I stood under the sycamore and sipped thyme and lemon and listened to people talking about everything and nothing. The sunlight slid down the bark in bright streaks. An elementary school class, shepherded by a patient teacher with a scarf that looked like a patchwork quilt, passed through the square on a field trip. The children waved to the cart like it was a landmark. One shouted, "Good morning, Mrs. Pemberley," without losing a step. She waggled the kettle in salute. Again someone said, "It's always been there," when the bell became the topic. Again the conversation moved on like a river around a stone. I started to understand that maybe the stone was what made the river beautiful. Maybe fighting it was the only way to drown. On the third morning, I brought my notebook to the cart and asked, "Is it all right if I write?" Mrs. Pemberley's eyebrows climbed. "What else would you do?" She placed a small plate with 2 tiny shortbread squares beside my mug as if I'd earned them. "Write with your whole self or not at all." "I used to write like I was being chased," I confessed. "Better to be led," she said, "or to walk alongside." She leaned closer. "The bell helps." I didn't ask how. Instead, I looked for what the city had taught me not to see. The things that didn't ask to be noticed. The way the man in the wool coat always took one slow circle around the tree before settling, as if he were winding himself. The way Ruth touched the sycamore's bark with the back of her fingers, the way you might test a child's forehead for fever. The way Theo lined up his thermos with the line in the cobblestones like it was a game only he played. The way the bell never rang while someone was speaking, only between, as if it too was practicing listening. I wrote the sentence about the bell being a beginning onto the page and let it drag others behind it. The words felt less like a report and more like a letter, and not a letter I planned to send to an editor or an algorithm or anyone with power over me, but to the thing inside me that had gone quiet and had mistaken its quiet for death. Later that week, I noticed a small chalkboard beside the tea cart that I hadn't seen before. It read, "What did the bell make you remember?" People wrote answers in the space below with a stub of white chalk. My grandmother's spoon tapping the rim of her cup. How my dog knows when I'm thinking of leaving the room. The day we painted the porch the wrong color and liked it anyway. I stared, then wrote, "The last time I let a beginning be small." I stepped back and watched the white smudge of my handwriting settle among the rest. I felt the heat rise to my face and then cool in the same breath, the way embarrassment can turn into relief if you let it. On the 7th day, I asked again, this time to no one in particular, "Do we really not know who rings it?" No one turned into a someone. A woman with silver hair braided down her back, dressed in a brown coat the color of burned sugar. Her eyes did a funny little dance at the corners, as if laughter lived there permanently, ready to step in. "Is our not knowing bothering you?" she asked, not unkindly. "It's new," I said. "In my old life, if we didn't know, we named it, or we Googled it, or we made up an answer and called it personal branding." I was joking, only halfway. She nodded, as if I'd offered her a good soup and she was pleased to have been invited. "Sometimes a town keeps one thing for itself," she said. "One thing it doesn't explain. Not to be hoarded, mind you. To be common property of mystery." "Common property of mystery," I echoed, admiring it because I am the kind of person who collects good phrases like shells. "I'm Mavis," she said, and I barked a laugh of recognition. "Ask me about moths." "I knew it was you," I said. "I'm Charity." "I know," she said, but not in a way that made my skin prickle. In a way that made me feel less alone. We talked moths for 20 minutes, their moon-pale bodies, their woolly heads, their impossible love of porch lights. Then she looked at the sky as if checking a clock written in clouds, and said, "The thing about the bell is it asks a simple question we keep avoiding. Will you join your neighbors this morning? No one's taking attendance. No one's grading it. You can fail as many days as you like. Still the question remains." She sipped. "I think you're a person who answers questions." I thought of deadlines, which had been questions with knives in them. I thought of editors, who had been voices I believed knew more than me and were sometimes right and always hungry. I thought of my mother's last voicemail, which I hadn't listened to yet because I worried it would make the day's edges collapse. My eyes stung. Mavis saw because she was a librarian, and librarians know many kinds of reading. She patted my arm once without commentary, then folded into a conversation with a teenager who wanted to know if it was true that some moths drank tears. It is. At sunset that evening, the square was empty except for the sycamore and me. I had bought a tiny bell, a purely decorative thing, from the antique shop on the corner. It was brass and a little silly. I set it on the stone wall and waited to see if the instinct to ring it would feel like sacrilege. It did, a bit. I didn't ring it. Instead, I sat with my hands folded and listened to the memory of the morning. In the window of Renford Bread and Book, someone had tucked a new card into the jar. The bell doesn't tell the day what to be. It reminds the day it's allowed to be. I wondered who had written it. I wondered if I would someday write sentences like that without asking myself who they would please, and instead asking only if they made anything truer. The next morning, when the bell called us again, I felt a small, certain shift inside me, as if something long clenched had opened a finger's width. I walked to the square with my mug and my notebook, and the knowledge that I was, at last, living a question I couldn't answer and didn't need to. I took my place by the sycamore. Mrs. Pemberley poured me lemon and thyme. Theo and Ruth waved. Mavis lifted her chin in hello and then returned to explaining a moth diagram on her phone to a fascinated 7-year-old. "Good morning," Mrs. Pemberley said, sliding the mug across. "Good morning," I echoed. "Do you ever worry?" I asked, and stopped myself. Worried about what? That the bell would stop? That the town would forget? That I would? The question slid around in my mouth like new teeth. She waited. She always did. "Do you ever worry?" I tried again. "That I'll start writing about this and make it into something people come looking to witness, instead of something we simply live?" It felt like confessing a transgression I hadn't committed yet. Mrs. Pemberley studied me for a breath. "If you write about it honestly, you will only make it larger in the way love makes anything larger," she said. "If you write about it with an angle, you will feel yourself shrinking while you do it. You know the difference. You've lived both." I nodded, a sudden heat in my face that was not shame exactly, but recognition. "Besides," she added, "you can only ever write about what you bring your mug to." The bell chimed again, sweet and unabashed. It rang, and we gathered. It rang, and we listened. It rang, and the town answered in the small ways that add up to a kind of singing. I saw it then. I didn't come to Renford for a miracle, but something miraculous was happening anyway. Not because the bell was magic, though some part of me was comfortable with that explanation, but because every morning people chose to be gently seen. They chose to hold a mug in one hand and the day in the other and learn how to drink both. I don't need to tell you who rings it. In Renford, the answer is both always and never, and every person you ask will shrug with a softness that means they've chosen their own peace with not knowing. Maybe that's the thing I had to move here to understand. That a mystery can be the most honest thing in a town, not because it hides something, but because it gathers us around the fact that we are gathered at all. So I write this now, Chapter 1 of whatever my life in Renford becomes, with the bell still ringing somewhere high and invisible, and Mrs. Pemberley's lemon and thyme in my cup, and Ruth and Theo's laughter sewing itself into the hem of the morning. I write knowing I'll carry this page down to the square tomorrow and tuck the first sentence into the bread and book jar because someone else might need a beginning. I write because for once the beginning isn't the shape of an obligation, but the sound of a bell that may as well be calling my name, as if it has always been there, and I have always been the person waking up to hear it. They say habits braid a life together in ways you don't notice until the day you're missing one strand and feel the whole rope slack. I didn't know I was the sort of person who needed 6 o'clock to ring like a small and certain truth. And yet, a week into Renford, The bell had become the seam of my mornings, the one neat stitch that kept everything else from fraying. I started waking before my phone glowed. I would lie there with my eyes closed and listen for the square to take its first breath, and then the sound would find me, clear and kind, a chime that came without hurry. The bell asked no questions and expected no answers, and maybe that was its trick. I got up. I put on the cardigan I'd decided could be called Morning Blue if someone asked, because names are a sort of blessing. I took my notebook and my chipped mug, the one I loved because the chip made it mine, and I went where the bell told us to go. By the third morning I had an unofficial spot along the low stone wall beneath the sycamore, close enough to the tea cart to help steady the sugar bowl when the cobbles made a wheel roll wobbly, far enough to be out of the mainstream of neighbors whenever someone told a story that needed room to bloom. At exactly the moment I settled, Mrs. Pemberley would lift her kettle with a look that said both I knew you'd come and I would have poured for you even if you hadn't. Lemon always. Thyme sometimes, and on Thursdays a tiny tincture that tasted like courage when courage is quiet. "Morning, Charity," she'd say, the greeting rounded by steam. "Morning, Mrs. Pemberley." Across the square, a retired teacher named Mr. Acker, white hair like milkweed, shoulders worn soft by years of leaning over desks, would pull a slender book from his satchel. He never announced himself. He simply began, as if he were reading a weather report the day had been waiting for. One poem, no more. Sometimes it was Mary Oliver, and the birds felt suddenly personal. Sometimes it was a haiku scribbled on a postcard he'd found in a library book and copied in his careful hand. Once he read a poem that was only 6 lines about a bowl of oranges, and somehow the whole square glowed as if someone had peeled one in the sunlight. There was no applause, just a murmur, thank you," from the kind part of a town's throat. He would nod, fold the book, and tuck it away like a candle you only burn long enough to scent the room. The young mother, her name was Esme, I learned, though half the square just called her Scones, arrived with a baby bound to her chest and a bulging basket on her arm. "For anyone who woke up on time," she'd say, and set the scones on the tea cart like an offering. Sometimes they were studded with blueberries that bled into the dough, sometimes rosemary and salt that made your mouth think of late summer even in the shiver of spring. I watched her sometimes, how she positioned her body so the baby would never be jostled while she served, how she made sure her basket was empty before she took a half scone for herself, how the corners of her mouth softened when she caught someone closing their eyes after the first bite. "It helps to feed people who help themselves out of bed," she told me once. "The kind of sentence you can live by if you're lucky." And there was a man whose name I didn't know at first. Tall, sun-brown, even in March, with a way of walking that told you he'd learned to keep pace with growing things. He carried a metal watering can with a wobbly handle and moved from planter to planter around the square, pouring light arcs into geraniums and trailing ivy, into a barrel of daffodils that had decided to be a little reckless with joy. He watered as the sun lifted, as if he and the day had an agreement about timing. Later I learned his name was Jonah, and that he worked the grounds at the small cemetery at the edge of town. "I like a day to wake thirsty and be answered," he said, which was perhaps the closest thing to theology I'd heard here. I came because the bell called and the tea was good. I stayed because the ritual kept showing me a town that had chosen, somehow, to be gentle on purpose. When Mr. Acker's hands shook more than usual, a teenager in a varsity jacket kept a thumb under the book's spine, steadying the paper without fanfare, and then turned away before anyone could thank him. When Esme looked tired in a way that made the edges of her sentences go thin, Ruth slipped the baby into her own arms and paced the square, humming a song that had to be older than both of them. When Jonah knelt to adjust the soil around a wilting marigold, 3 different people paused their conversations mid-laugh, bent down and held the leaves in that lovely, ridiculous way people hold the head of a flower like it could be reassured. The bell did not fix grief or prevent it. I would never make that mistake of romanticizing a sound. But I watched it, day by day, make a shape around hard things that kept them from rolling free and crushing whoever stood closest. The kind of comfort that doesn't declare itself comfort. I think that's what the bell gave us. We arrived in our various mornings and made a small ring of attention around what hurt. The hurting person didn't have to stand in the center. Sometimes no one stood there. The ring was still made. I kept noticing moments like I was training my eyes to see them the way a person trains themselves to notice birdsong. First the obvious ones, then what hides within them. A man with the well-scrubbed hands of a baker came, once, with redness blooming around his eyes like a sunrise you didn't want. He didn't speak to anyone. He held his mug with both hands like he was waiting to be filled or braced for what would spill. A woman I'd never seen before stood beside him and did nothing except match her breathing to his, easy and slow, until I watched his shoulders drop a half-inch. On another morning, a girl with a backpack decorated in safety pins left her bike crooked against the stone wall and asked if anyone knew what to do when you want to go, but you also want to stay and somehow both feel like drowning. 4 different people answered at once and then, abashed, laughed. Mr. Acker said, "We could read that out loud." Mavis said, "We could make tea that tastes like deciding." Jonah handed her the watering can so she could give the daffodils a drink. Her face steadied as the water arced. I wrote, but not with the hot, hungry pen I used to. I wrote like a person placing small shells on a windowsill, not to own the ocean, but to remember that I had been there to hear it. I began collecting sentences in a folder I called Renford Mornings, and every night before bed I reread a few. It was a way of keeping the bell's echo in reach when the dark went heavy. It worked. Or maybe I worked, finally, at something that wasn't the work that had eaten me alive. Because I was writing again. Because the engine that had stalled and nearly drowned me had coughed once and flared, and then miraculously softened into a reliable hum. I noticed something else, a line that had been waiting just past the corner of my attention. The town insisted the bell had always been there. This wasn't an evasion so much as a posture. Still, to say a thing had always been is to declare it beyond the scope of normal questions. And yet questions are oxygen to me. Not the kind that pries, the kind that opens windows. I didn't want to pry, but I did want to breathe. I started walking earlier, wanting to feel the town before the chime. Dawn in Renford is almost embarrassingly tender. The baker flips his sign to kneading before open. The cat that owns the alley between the hardware store and the thrift shop patrols with the particular dignity of creatures who never once considered rent. The hill behind the square wears fog like a scarf left on the back of a chair. I took these walks as a sacrament, one foot in front of the other, the street making its kind sound under my boots. On the fourth of these early mornings, I found Mr. Acker and asked if I could walk with him the length of the square and back, because I couldn't think of anything nicer to do than pace beside someone whose voice had become a sort of metronome for my day. He agreed, as if I'd offered him the chance to be kinder to his knees. "Were you a teacher long?" I asked. "A while." He smiled with one side of his mouth. "Time is a rope. You pull on one end and the other does what it wants." "And the poems?" "Always." He patted the satchel. "We used to keep a poetry jar in my classroom. Everyone had to read when they drew a slip. Everyone dreaded it. Then, of course, everyone loved it. What was the point?" "Habit." He tipped his head toward the sycamore like it could answer. "And to coax goodness to the surface, the way you can coax butter from cream if you're willing to take your time." We circled the square and stood under the sycamore while people began to arrive. And I noticed with a little jolt of delight a new thing. A sliver of stairwell door tucked between two buildings on the east side, painted the same soft green as the trim of the old apothecary. Had that door always been there? Probably. Everything in Renford had the courtesy to precede you. The door had no sign. It didn't need one. Its frame was narrow, the top lintel low enough I imagined even a very average head would bump it if the person rushed. It looked like the entrance to a pocket. "The bell tower," Mr. Acker said, following my gaze as casually as if he'd said, "The sky," or "That is a pigeon." "Oh," I managed, and then, "I thought," but stopped. What had I thought? That the bell rang from nowhere and everywhere like a story the town had agreed to tell? that the sycamore had learned to sing, that anything unknown was better left in peace? Everything that rings has to live somewhere, he said, even a truth. After that, I kept half an eye on that narrow door. Not always, not with hunger. Just the way you keep an eye on the kettle, attentive, patient, unafraid to be called away by conversation. I didn't see anyone slip through. I didn't see the door open. The paint along the knob was scuffed, which means hands. The edges of the threshold were clean, which means sweeping. Someone was tending it. No one was naming themselves. "Do you want to know?" Ruth asked me once, catching me staring. "I do," I said, honest and a little embarrassed. "But I also don't want to want it in a way that spoils the wanting." She laughed, delighted. "Oh, Charity, that's the most Renford thing I've ever heard you say." The fog came 2 mornings later like a guest who refused to choose a chair and instead draped itself over everything. I woke to the bells of my own apartment, radiator clanks, kettle whistles, sounding slightly farther away. I stepped into the street and lost the end of my lane before I reached it. The square grew out of the gray slowly, like paper soaked in water until ink appears. The sycamore was a charcoal sketch, the birdhouses athwart its branches like punctuation marks. The tea cart was there, and Mrs. Pemberley's hair was a weather system, and the kettle was a lighthouse in the fog. I smiled into my mug as she poured. "Fog always makes the town more itself," she said, as if she could hear my thinking. We stopped mistaking distance for clarity. Only a few of us had come, the hour and the weather sorting out the faithful from the willing, neither more righteous than the other. I stood with my back against the stone and watched the fog get rearranged by what passed through it. A couple walking arm in arm, a dog like a small cloud at the end of a leash. Jonah, watering can in hand, watering what he could not fully see and trusting the roots to tell him thank you later. "I might read too," Mr. Acker called softly, his voice made big by the muffling. "Fog demands an extra line." We laughed, and in the laughter I felt myself choose this morning over 100 other mornings I would not live, and the choosing was a relief. I had come early, earlier than anyone knew, because no one was keeping time except the bell, and the bell had not yet spoken. I wanted to feel the town before the chime, the way you run a finger along a page before you write on it. I turned my head toward the green door by habit. I wasn't hunting. My eyes were simply being eyes. That's when I saw it. A shape detaching itself from the fog and gliding along the apothecary wall. So quietly it made me think of moths again, how they can be there and then, in a blink, elsewhere. The figure paused at the door, hand out, a small moment like a breath held. Then the door opened, a narrower sliver of dark in the light, and the shadow slipped inside. The door eased shut. The fog closed around the absence like water made of silk. My heart did not thunder. It tapped once, hard enough to rearrange a few files inside my chest, and then settled. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I didn't even look at anyone else to see if they'd seen. The moment felt private in the way a sunrise can feel private even when you know the whole world has been up to watch it with you. I stood in the fog with my lemon thyme tea and thought, oh. And then, because the world is both mundane and miraculous, the bell rang. The first chime lifted like a spoon out of a bowl and then poured itself down over us. The square changed texture. Heads turned, not toward the sound in the way you look for the source of a siren, but toward one another, the way you look when someone you love walks into a room. The second chime followed, spaced like a slow sentence you could memorize by afternoon. The fog absorbed the sound and then released it back, softened. It was like hearing a story through a wall. It was like being inside a chest as it breathed. I leaned barely toward the door in my peripheral vision, then away. The bell rang again. Mr. Acker lifted his book. Esme tucked her baby closer. Jonah tipped his can. Mrs. Pemberley's kettle hissed its little approval. The world was exactly itself and entirely different for my having seen the shadow enter that narrow space. I could tell you I knew whose shadow it was. I didn't. It had the shape of a person. That's as far as my seeing went. It might have been a child or a woman or a man or a person who believed in neither or both. It might have been the baker or the librarian or someone who came from the next town over on mornings when the fog meant no one would recognize them by the cut of their coat. It might have been you. The not knowing was not painful. It fitted itself to the town's soft shrug of "it's always been there," and then, like any well-fitting garment, warmed me. Still, I was who I am. My pen, always nearby, moved. I wrote in my notebook, in a hand steadier than I felt. Fog, door, shadow, chime. The words looked like a child's first sentence, a pile of nouns waiting for a verb to make them sing. I added, "The bell is rung by a person," which should have been obvious but somehow felt newly sacred to say. Beneath that, smaller in case I needed to deny it later, "This comforts me," because it did. The idea that a human body climbed narrow stairs before dawn, hand on the rail, breath even, mind attentive, to lift an arm and set a town's morning in motion, that idea made the days feel held. The bell, it turned out, wasn't a magic that removed us from ourselves. It was a magic that required us, which is the best kind, if you ask me. An enchantment that asks for your name at the end. I stood with my knowledge and kept it the way you keep a pebble in your pocket, not as a weapon, but as something to finger when the world goes complicated. I didn't tell anyone, not right away. Not because I wanted to hoard it, but because the fog felt like a witness I shouldn't talk over. The bell finished its sentences and left the square quiet enough to hold a poem. Mr. Acker read two after all. One about a lighthouse, one about a woman who used fog to make her own edges gentle. When he was done, we breathed as if we remembered how to. "Another scone?" Esme asked me in the silence after the second poem, as if there were a proper number of scones for a morning like this. "Please," I said, "do you ever sleep?" She laughed softly, shook her head, lifted the basket. "Only in chapters." I took another and broke it in half, offered the larger piece to the teenager in the varsity jacket who had, unbeknownst to him, worn heroism earlier in the week like a comfortable shirt. He smiled, embarrassed, and took the smaller half, because kindness like that is also a habit here. "Fog does my work for me," Jonah said, coming up beside me, eyes bright. "Everything drinks without me having to ask." "Even us," I said, meaning the bell as much as the fog, meaning the poems, meaning this strange, steady way of living. He nodded, and the nod felt like a prayer. The day lifted, as days do, and the fog peeled itself off the square, leaving the pavement damp and the air with that post-rain taste that convinces you the world just made itself new. By then the door had resumed its benign anonymity. The shadow had presumably become a person again, blurred into the morning like sugar into tea. I didn't chase them with questions. I did not camp the door. I would not, I decided, become a detective who sacrificed a ritual to catch the person who made it possible. That is not the kind of story I wanted to live. On my way home, I paused by the bread and book jar and wrote, "The bell is a human act of courage repeated." I tucked the card into the pile and felt my heart do that small reordering again. The tap that told me something inside had shifted into a better place. The next days unfurled in their small ways. The bell rang, the town gathered, people made room for one another's mornings. I began to think of Renford not as a quiet town, the way travel brochures meant it, but as a town that had learned how to begin. That is rarer. The beginning shows up in small gestures no one catalogues. A hand steadying a book, a scone made for someone who didn't quite believe they were the sort of person who deserved sweetness before 8. The glint of water in a geranium's soil. And beneath it all, the human hand on the stair rail, the human hand on the rope or the lever or whatever mechanism woke the metal into song. I even found myself, one clear morning when the wind wore the faintest smell of cut grass, standing by the green door 5 minutes before 6. The fog was a rumor, the world entirely observable. I did not touch the knob. I did not lean my ear against the wood. I simply stood there long enough to hear my own breath, and then, when I felt it steady, walked back to my spot beneath the sycamore. I was perhaps practicing how to be in proximity to mystery without insisting it zip itself open for me. The bell rang. I smiled. It felt like being let into a secret you had already been living. I told Mavis eventually. Not as a confession, not as a revelation. More as the way you tell a librarian that you finally found the book you were sure you needed to read years ago and never could, because now the sentences don't scare you. I saw a shadow go into the tower, I said, keeping my voice easy. Before the first chime, Mavis's mouth tugged up on one side. Shadow is a very good name for whoever it was, she said. Does everyone know? Everyone knows, she said, which surprised me less than it should have. And no one knows. I nodded. I don't want to know more, I added, surprising us both. Or, I do, but I want the wanting to stay kind. That's a good sentence, she said. You should write it down. Then, softer, some secrets are communal. We hold them together, not to keep anyone out, but to keep ourselves in. I thought of that the next morning when a stranger, briefcase, tight jaw, the look of someone who had tried to resign from urgency and been refused, wandered into the square just before the bell. He looked like the version of me that had taken a midnight train out of the city before I admitted I couldn't work my way out of not being able to work. His shoulders were small, but his suit made them square. He stood at the edge as if steps were something people would count and find him wanting. Tea? Mrs. Pemberley asked, kettle tilted in invitation. He hesitated as if there might be a form to fill out first. Then he nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said, exhausting himself with those 2 syllables. He drank. He exhaled. He stayed. The bell rang, and I watched his face loosen around the place a jaw unclenches when it has been fighting a long losing battle with itself. I didn't think of the shadow and the door and the narrow stairs as a secret then. I thought of them as the small human labor behind ease. I thought of them as scones, as poems, as water poured when the sun came up, as a rope pulled early enough to make 6 o'clock ring like a promise. On Sundays there are 2 chimes, the same bell twice, with a longer space between, as if time itself were taking a breath. The first announces the morning. The second announces a little market that appears along the square like a pop-up book. Eggs in cardboard crates, wool in skeins that look like the townspeople's hair colors, lavender bouquets tied with string. I wandered among the tables and bought a bundle of tulips for the chipped mug that had been demoted to vase. Jonah sold me a handful of seedlings with instructions written in block letters on the paper bag. Sun whenever it can, water whenever you remember. I loved Renford's approach to should. Are you writing about us yet? Ruth asked, one eyebrow lifting, not because she needed to be part of anyone's story, but because she knew I needed to be part of mine. Yes, I said, and no. I patted my bag where my notebook lived. I'm making a shelf of small beginnings. That's all this is, she said, sweeping one hand in a small arc that managed to include the square, the market, the bell, and her own chest. A good shelf. The fog returned 2 mornings later, thinner this time, like silk instead of wool. I found myself early again. I stood where I had stood before and watched the world move in outline. The door did not open, or maybe it did, and the fog took it for itself and gave me only the sound. That was fine with me. The bell rang. I breathed. The town tilted its head toward one another, and we began again in that way that never pretends this will make the hard things easy, only that it will make the hard things held. I'm learning to love wanting to know without needing to know. I'm learning the way a chime can become a question you answer with your feet. I'm learning how to notice. That's a craft, the same as turning butter or coaxing a lily to forgive the cold snap, or pulling a rope at dawn and sending a song over roofs and under doorways and into the soft places of a town. I've learned the names of the regulars and the schedules of the irregulars. I've learned where the sun first hits the cobbles and which stone along the wall holds heat the longest in your hands. I've learned to listen for the sound the bell makes after it stops, the light hum that lives in the air for a beat, the way a poem lives in the mouth after you've swallowed it. If you asked me what the bell is, I would say it is a gentle mystery with human hands behind it. If you asked me what the bell does, I would say it multiplies what we bring to the square, like a blessing said over bread that already smells like home. And if you asked me who slips into the narrow door on foggy mornings, I would say I saw a shadow and I felt comfort, and I wrote it down, and I will keep coming, because that's the answer worth having, that I am here, with my chipped mug and my small beginnings, listening for the chime that tells me once again that the day has held a place for me, and I, astonishingly, have held a place for it. The morning I decided to follow the shadow, Renford's light felt like a hand on my back, not pushing exactly, just letting me know I could go where I needed to. Fog still stitched the square, though thinner than the day I first saw the figure slip through the green door. I left my apartment before the kettle finished its breath, carrying my mug empty on purpose. I wanted my hands free to hold the rail of that narrow stair or to hold my nerve, whichever needed it. The town had taught me to love questions that didn't demand answers. It had not, however, erased the part of me that loves a door for being a door. I stood by the old apothecary, the paint of the door frame soft with age, and felt for the seam in the fog where the figure might arrive. The bell had not rung. The square felt like the breath just before a name is said. When the shadow appeared, it did so with the unremarkable grace of someone who has made the same passage for years. A coat, well mended and the kind of brown that belongs to soil more than cloth. A hat with a crown caved in by use. a movement that was careful without being timid. The figure reached for the knob, paused in a way that could have been prayer or habit, and turned it. I did not announce myself. I did not clear my throat or call out. I slipped in behind, easing the door shut with both hands as if the quiet could break. The stairwell was narrow enough I imagined it preferred a single body at a time. I tried to make mine smaller. The smell of wood warmed by years, of metal warmed by hands. I could see the figure ahead of me as a bent line, steady and patient. The stair wound tighter than I expected. The walls touched my shoulders with their breath. Each step had a polite creak, as if it felt obliged to register our presence. I matched the figure's pace. I did not want to loom. I did not want to arrive as a question with teeth. At the top, the stair opened into a small room that had been tidied by someone who trusts their future self to be grateful. A stool near the window, a shelf with a tin of oil, a coil of rope the width of a thumb, a cloth draped over a brass bell's mouth like a shawl. The figure pushed the cloth back with the tenderness of someone lifting a blanket from a sleeping child. The bell was not grand. It was the size of a large mixing bowl, its metal dulled by use, the lip softened by time. A rope hung from its clapper and ran through a pulley in the ceiling to a knot anchored to a beam. The figure, now a man unmistakably as he set his hat on the stool, turned his face toward me. It was a face I recognized the way you recognize the handwriting on an old recipe card. You've been reading it for months without knowing who wrote it. Mr. Ellis, the groundskeeper of the town hall and the courthouse lawn. I had seen him sweeping the steps with a bristle broom twice a week, trimming the hedges into their humble precision, oiling hinges that did not yet squeak because he had the sort of relationship with sound that understood prevention as a kind of love. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis," I said, because if the moment needed anything, it needed a gentle truth. He blinked once, not startled so much as adjusting to the idea that the stairwell had delivered him a companion. "Miss Charity," he said, because my name had found its way through town without my instruction. "You're early." "So are you," I said. My breath felt right in my chest. It didn't hammer or light up like a warning. It sat where it belonged. He smiled with one side of his mouth. "On time," he corrected, and lifted the rope with both hands. The clapper brushed the bell's side with the lightest kiss. "We must keep good accounts with morning." "I followed you," I said, in case I needed to apologize for it. "I saw a week ago on a foggy morning. I didn't want to make a habit of being a detective, but I wanted—" I stopped. It's hard to confess to curiosity without it sounding like hunger. "You wanted to put a hand on the rail," he finished kindly. "It is a comfort to know how some things are done. Most things, I find." He nodded toward the small window, the square beyond it still a study in smudge. It will take the fog another minute. Have you eaten? I shook my head. He reached behind the stool and produced, with a little flourish, a tissue-wrapped parcel. My wife taught me to bring provision for the bell, he said. Your body should not be asked to do a kindness on an empty stomach. He offered me a shortbread square and held his own as if it might be a coin he'd been saving for just this purchase. Thank you, I said, meaning the sentence more widely than the cookie. We ate. The bell, uncovered, seemed to wait with us not as an object, but as a neighbor who had dressed for company. I didn't come to interfere, I added, the words gentle as I could make them. Only to understand. He nodded again. Understanding is a kind of oil, he said. Keeps the metal from complaining. He looked at the rope with a fondness that made it briefly alive. I can show you if you like. The first pull is the one that asks. The second is the one that answers. I would like, I said, and stepped back to give him room. He wrapped the rope around his hand and then thought better of it and unwrapped it, just holding it as it was. There is, it turns out, a way to ring a bell that is less about force and more about feeling. He gave it the gentlest tug, and the sound that swam into the air was exactly the sound we hear in the square, only closer, the way a word seems larger when you say it into someone's shoulder. He waited, hand still. He pulled again. The bell said yes. Every morning? I asked, soft. Most. He smiled at his mistake and let it be. Every morning I can, and when I could not... His voice lifted at the end, leaving space for a truth that could enter without knocking. I have trained too over the years. They come when the world asks them to, not on a schedule. It keeps the bell from learning my joints. He looked at me then, straight and unafraid. You won't write their names. I won't, I said. I wouldn't have written yours. He blinked a thank you. The rope carried the smallest vibration into his fingers. He smoothed it with his palm. It used to be my wife, he said. There was no sadness in the sentence, only a wit that allowed sadness to travel through it. She had the hand for it, the right sort of patience. The first morning she rang it, it was still raining. The storm? I said, feeling the town's past press into the room like another person. I hadn't been here, but the story had a shape in the way people spoke of certain summers. The floods? He nodded. The river got ahead of itself, he said, and his small joke moved a stone aside so water could trickle through. People were already gathering, but in that way gathering happens when you don't know what to do with your hands. My Mabel, his mouth softened on her name, stood in the square and watched neighbors step around each other like furniture. She said, "They need a call that doesn't sound like trouble." The bell, I said, and felt my throat apprecate how obviousness can be holy. The bell, he echoed. This one had been not retired exactly, but quieter than it liked. It used to ring for market open and close, for court sessions starting, for a school dismissal when the whistle froze in winter. His eyes creased around a memory I could almost see. She asked the council if she could ring it at 6. For what? They asked, and she said, "For the day." He paused, letting me admire the answer. No one knew then it would become habit. Perhaps she did. My wife knew habit's shape. He pulled the rope again. The third chime shook the fog as if waking it gently. We both listened to the sound's long finish, the way it hung like a fragrance after a person has left a room. "I like knowing she started it," I said, honest. "It fits." "It was small at first," he said. 6 or 7 of us. Tea in jars because we did not yet have the cart. Mabel saying nothing loud, but being loud in the way she poured. His gaze slid sideways to the shelf where the tin of oil sat. It had a label, hand-lettered, Pemberley, Bell Oil. He patted the tin the way you pat a child on the head when you do not wish to make a fuss. Mrs. Pemberley was her friend. Brought biscuits the first week. Laughed at how many spoons we didn't own. By month's end she'd built the cart out of an old door and 2 banisters from a house that was coming down. Said, "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it the way morning deserves." I smiled, picturing the cart's blue enamel kettle bridged between then and now, the way objects can anchor a story more gently than dates ever could. "Does Mrs. Pemberley know?" He made a soft sound. "We do not learn the roots of an oak by interrogating leaves," he said, which I took to mean some knowledge is relational. You earn it with time and small labor. "She knows enough. She always has." He looked at me with a sweetness that didn't turn me into a child. "And now you do too." "Why keep it a secret?" I asked. The question wore the sort of coat it needs to keep from catching cold. "If people knew?" "If people knew," he said, and here something in his face loosened, as if he'd been waiting for the moment when he could say this. "I worried they would thank me." He swallowed, and the swallow had a history in it. "And if they thanked me, they would have named the bell to a person. I wanted it to stay named to the town. I learned a long time ago that if you give a human face to a thing, people bring to it all the complicated kindness and complicated guilt they have for faces. Better sometimes to let a ritual be its own body." It was a generous fear, I realized, the kind that doesn't shrink the world but protects its wideness. "So you hid," I said, without blame. "I stood to the side," he corrected, "and when Mabel dies—" He said it in the present tense without meaning to, and corrected himself with a gentle nod. "When she died," he repeated. I kept the time, not because I thought I was the only one who could, but because I knew grief makes you forget the easiest truths. Mourning is a truth. The sound of everyone deciding to begin is a truth. I wanted to make sure we didn't forget. He pulled again. The bell's fourth chime lifted through the window and spilled into the square. I imagined it finding Mrs. Pemberley's ladle, Esme's basket, Jonah's watering can, Mr. Acker's book. I imagined it making room in everyone's decisions. I imagined it touching the shoulder of the teenager in the varsity jacket and the man with the well-scrubbed hands and the girl who felt both leaving and staying like drowning. The sound has hands. I'd always known it. Now I knew whose hands lifted it. "Did you ever think about stopping?" I asked. "Only in the way a man thinks of setting down a bucket to flex his fingers," he said. "The thought doesn't bring shame with it. It brings blood back to your palm. Then you pick the bucket up again, or someone else reaches for it." He half smiled. "Sometimes the council tells me to rest. That's why I train too. They are good at being quiet inside their quiet." He tipped his head in apology. "I won't say who." "I won't ask," I said, and felt the thrill of not asking in the place that used to be addicted to answers. He sat on the stool and placed his palm against the bell, feeling the last of the note. "It mattered to me that the bell didn't become a performance," he said. "That's the other danger of faces. When something has a face, people come to watch the face, not to hear the sound." He looked at me in a way that made me feel seen and also responsible. "You are a writer." "I am trying to remember how," I said. "Good," he said simply. "Then you will know the difference between making a thing larger and making yourself larger inside it." I did. The knowledge made me feel both chastened and held. He stood again and called the fifth chime. It rolled out like a small tide. I thought briefly of Mabel listening to this same sound with a rope in her hand and a town at her feet. A woman who saw we needed a beginning that wasn't an emergency. I thought about beginnings, how they are an easy thing to say and a hard thing to practice. I thought about the bell as thread, and my chest felt loose in the good way that allows breath to do its job. "You feared the ritual would die if anyone knew," I said, putting his thought in my mouth to see how it felt there. "That people would stop believing in the kind of magic that requires them." He smiled, fully this time, the kind of smile that makes new lines at the corners of the eyes instead of just deepening the old. "Yes," he said, "and no. I feared it would get named and therefore argued with. As long as it was the bell, people could bring to it what they needed. The minute it was Ellis's bell, or Mabel's bell, or the council's bell, then it becomes opinion. And opinion is loud in the morning. Magic is quiet. I won't name it, I said. I felt the pledge stand upright in me. It didn't feel like keeping a secret. It felt like being given a task. I'll write around it as a person writes around a sky. No one needs to be told where the blue comes from to feel it. He laughed, a soft thing. Exactly. Mabel would have liked you. He looked out the window. The fog had thinned to lace. I could see the square waking, Ruth's hat, Esme's basket, Mrs. Pemberley's steam, Jonah's watering can catching the light like a small moon. They're gathering. Shall I go down? I asked, suddenly shy about continuing to witness what I had never before witnessed. In a moment, he said. We'll finish. It doesn't like to be left mid-sentence. He rang the sixth, and the bell's voice settled into me like a line I would carry for a long time. We stood in the lingering hum, two people and a memory of a third, and let it attach itself to our skin. When the air went still again, he draped the cloth over the bell's mouth the way one covers a bowl of dough to rise. He was not coddling it. He was respecting it. On the stairs he went ahead of me because the stairs like to know the order of things. At the bottom he paused with his hand on the knob. You won't tell Mrs. Pemberley you came up? He asked. It was not an order. It was a question that carried trust in it, the way a person's hand can carry your mug and not spill. I'll only tell her I am grateful, I said, which she already knows. We stepped into the square. The world was whole in its ordinary. No one looked up at the tower door. No one scanned faces for guilt. Mavis was showing a child a moth-shaped pin she'd stitched on her bag. Mr. Acker tapped his book in a slow rhythm against his knee. The varsity jacket kid handed a biscuit to a man who looked like he hadn't been handed anything tender in a while. Morning had the good sense to proceed without needing our explanation. I went to the tea cart. Lemon? Mrs. Pemberley asked, already knowing. Yes, please, I said. And I paused because I wanted to put a blessing into the cup without making her carry its weight. Thank you for keeping us in good company with Dawn. She looked at me in that particular way people look when you've said something that lands exactly where it is needed. Not with surprise, not with pride, but with relief on behalf of something larger than either of you. It isn't the worst thing I've done with a kettle, she said. Then, as if she were teasing only the air, not me. Best not to ask where the oil comes from for the hinges that hold up a town. I'm practicing not asking, I said. Very good, she replied, and handed me my cup. I found my place at the wall. The square wore a softness after fog that made edges seem generously drawn. Jonah watered the geraniums like he'd gotten an early start, He caught my eye and tipped the can in greeting. Esme laughed and adjusted the baby, who had grown heavy in the way babies grow heavy when they trust the person holding them to make standing still enough like flying. Ruth passed by and palmed me half a scone without stopping. It was, in all measurable ways, a normal morning. Inside my chest, though, there was a new line drawn lightly in pencil. Staircase, rope, cloth, bell. A man who loved a woman who loved a town. A decision made after rain to call us to something other than trouble. A fear that our desire to name and thank and make personal would eclipse the exact magic that had been built for us. A magic that is daily, simple, and held by many hands. I felt suddenly, achingly grateful to have been invited to the top of the stairs, not by a note or a grand gesture, but by my own feet and Mr. Ellis's simple nod. It placed upon me a small duty, not to expose, not to gather praise, not to hoard a secret, but to tend the story the way Jonah tended the soil. Light arcs, right timing, trust in roots. I could do that. I could write the bell as if it were weather and we were its landscape, not the other way around. The poem that morning was by a poet I didn't know but felt I must have met in another life. It had a line about a woman who wakes the day with her whole body, and I swallowed hard around Mabel's name rising in my mouth unattended. Mr. Acker closed the book and patted the cover like a dog that had behaved. "Some mornings ask you to make a promise," he said. "Some mornings keep one for you." We hummed, which is the sound the square makes when it agrees. I stayed until the tea cart wheels jostled the sugar bowl, until the baby found the exact square of my shoulder that would make him sigh, until the teenager pretended not to take a second scone and then looked at me to see if pretending worked. It did. I walked home with my mug empty and my folder heavier. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote, quickly and then carefully, about hands and rails and the way a bell room smells like metal softened by years. I did not write names. I wrote, "The bell is rung by a person, yes, but it also rings a person into being. Its sound is a thread, and we, by arriving, agree to be threaded." At noon, when light stood straight in the windows, I walked back to the square with an index card. I wrote in my best good enough letters, "A ritual stays alive not because it is anonymous, but because it belongs to everyone who shows up." I tucked it into the jar at Bread and Book. I did not look around to see if anyone saw me do it. I am learning to trust the work of my own hand without an audience. That evening, as the sun soaked the sycamore in a gold that felt like a secret kept for the last hour of the day, I saw Mr. Ellis sweeping the town hall steps. I lifted a hand. He lifted his broom. It passed for a salute. We were even, if that's a thing one should ever want in the presence of grace. As night tucked itself into the corners of Renford, I stood at my window and thought of the knot in the bell rope. of the oil tin labeled by a friend, of a woman who decided during rain to ring a beginning instead of an alarm, of a man who kept the time unclaimed because it was the only way to keep it shared. The bell was not merely a signal. It was a thread someone chose to weave and someone else chose to keep weaving. I saw the square differently now, not as a set of individuals who happened to arrive at the same hour, but as a cloth that had been mended so often the mending itself was the pattern. In the city, I learned to survive on deadlines that felt like cliffs. In Renford, I am learning to live by a bell that feels like a bridge. Tomorrow, someone will climb the narrow stairs. A hand will warm the rope. The bell will speak. We will answer with mugs and poems and water and bread. No one will say a name. Everyone will feel their own settle more gently inside their chest. That, I think, is the magic Mr. Ellis feared would be taken from us if we knew. Not the wonder of the sound, but the wonder of our part in it. Knowing now, I do not love the mornings less. I love them differently. The bell is a thread. It runs through us. And all we have to do, astonishingly, is keep showing up to be sown. I woke to the kind of silence that isn't empty at all, just full of what should have been there. For a beat I lay very still, waiting for the bell to correct itself, to lift its clear note and pour it down the roof lines. The quiet stretched. The radiator clicked once, startled at its own noise. A bird tested the morning and decided against it. I sat up. My phone's alarm buzzed with all the confidence of a traffic cone. I silenced it and listened again. Nothing. I could feel the town listening with me, the way you can feel a room lean toward a door that hasn't opened yet. I pulled on my sweater and my boots, slid my notebook into my pocket, and, without thinking to brew water, took my mug and went out. Mill End smelled like wet culverts and the promise of bread, the kind of promises a place keeps whether you're watching or not. As I turned toward the square, I saw them, neighbors emerging, heads tilted like we were trying to hear a far-off train. A few stopped on their stoops and waited as if the bell were only late, never absent. Others started walking anyway, mugs held a little closer to their chests, as if the porcelain itself might offer direction. The square formed itself around the sycamore with a question in the middle. No chime to lace us together, just faces scanning. The tea cart closed and still. Mrs. Pemberley not yet arrived. Mr. Acker stood with his satchel unopened, one hand pressed gently over the book like you might steady a sleeping dog. Esme, scone basket under her arm, shifted the baby and looked at the clock above the bakery, because sometimes clocks tell the truth you think you already know. Jonah had his watering can but hadn't lifted it, the water inside making that slow sound water makes when it's thinking. Ruth and Theo had their scarves half on, half off, as if ready to adjust based on whether 6 o'clock became itself or not. "Is it?" Someone began. Maybe someone else tried. No one finished because the not finishing felt correct. The silence wasn't a hole, it was a held breath. I looked at the green door between the old apothecary and town hall trim, the door I now couldn't unsee. It was shut the way a book is shut, not to keep you out, but because it can't read itself. A small tug in my chest, concern, certainty, something shaped like a word I hadn't learned yet, pulled me forward. I touched Ruth's sleeve. "I'm going to check on Mr. Ellis," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to me, and also like it belonged to whoever needed it. "Will you tell Mrs. Pemberley if she comes that I've gone?" Ruth nodded, eyes soft. "Go," she said. "I'll hold the questions until you get back." The town hall steps had already been swept yesterday. I could tell because the dust gathered in polite corners. I knocked on the side door, the one I had once seen him use when he didn't want to make a fuss on the front steps. No answer. I knocked again and called, "Mr. Ellis? It's Charity." My voice echoed in the corridor. Wood, varnish, the faint ghost of lemon oil. A minute, then the slow scuff of slippers. The door opened to a slice, then wider. There he was, hatless, sweater buttoned wrong, color absent from his face in a way that made me immediately reorganize what I thought mattered this morning. "Ah," he said softly, as if I'd arrived to confirm something he'd suspected. "I'm late." I stepped inside. "You're unwell," I said, because he looked like a table missing one leg. "Sit, please." He let me steer him to a chair in the tiny office off the hall, the one with the window that faced the geranium barrel. Someone had taped a postcard of the seaside to the sill. Beside it sat an oil tin labeled in Mrs. Pemberley's hand. Bell, hinge, and heart. The label made my throat tighten. It felt like love, that pun, ridiculous and exactly right. He sank slowly, like a person with reverence for sitting. I woke in the dark and thought, not today. My knees and my chest had a conversation and decided against stairs. "Good," I said immediately, because I needed him to know staying put could be holy. "Good, we can—" My mouth raced to catch up with the part of my body already about to stand. "I'll run. I'll ring it. I know the steps. He caught my wrist with 2 fingers, gentle as a moth landing. "No," he said, not to stop me forever, but to set the moment down where it belonged. "Not alone the first time. Not like this." "What then?" I asked, already itching to carry anything he wanted me to carry. He breathed in that way people breathe when they aren't entirely convinced it will help. "Tell them," he said. "Tell them to talk. It's time they chose what they already are." He saw my face turn toward the stairs anyway. He smiled, thin, tired, stubborn. If you run up there without the town's say, you will be right and wrong at the same time." He tilted his head toward the square. "Go gather them, then come back." I wanted to argue. The longing to fill the silence with the bell's sound pricked my skin like nettles. But I had learned enough to know that the bell's power was not in sound alone. It was in the choosing. I squeezed his hand. "I'll be back," I said, and because that didn't seem like enough to hold the room together, added, "Do you want anything?" "Tea?" He shook his head. "Tell Pemberley she's not allowed to bring me the strong stuff. I'll jump out of my skin." "Water?" I asked, searching for something to put in my hands that would help. He nodded toward the shelf. "There. And the little blue pill bottle behind the History of Renford you won't finish." I fetched both, the way a person fetches a candle in a power outage, quickly, carefully, grateful for the remembered location. He took the pill, washed it down, leaned back. "Go on," he said. "You'll do right by it." The square, on my return, had begun to hum. Not a happy sound and not despair either. More like a troupe tuning instruments without a conductor, each finding a note in the neighborhood of the note they hoped for. Mrs. Pemberley had arrived and rolled the cart to its place, setting cups in a row as if cups on their own could steady a day. Mavis stood with both hands wrapped around a black thermos, knuckles pale. Mr. Acker had opened his satchel and then closed it again, a gesture that broke my heart for no logical reason. "He's all right," I called, because that was true in the most important sense. Heads turned toward me as toward weather. "He's ill. Nothing dire, we hope. But he can't take the stairs this morning." Relief moved through the square like wind through wheat. Visible, directional, brief. People exhaled. "So that's why," Theo said, and rubbed a hand over his jaw, as if this knowledge required a small grooming. I stood on the low step of the tea cart so I could see faces, and they could see mine not hide. "I know some of you know this already," I said. "Some of you don't. The bell isn't magic in the way that doesn't need us." I glanced at Mavis. She lifted her chin in permission. "It has been Mr. Ellis most mornings. It began—" I looked toward the town hall window, even though we couldn't see through it from here. "With his wife, after the storm years ago, to call us to something that wasn't trouble. He kept it going because he's stubborn and because he loves us. He did not want a face on it because faces gather the wrong sort of attention. But this morning there is a face, mine, I suppose, telling you there is a stair that needs feet and a rope that needs hands." My voice shook once, then steadied. "What would you like to do?" For a second the square held the silence on purpose. Then it broke open beautifully. "I can climb," the varsity jacket kid said, voice low like he didn't want to spook the morning. "If someone shows me how." "I'll go with him," Jonah said. I know the steps when they squeak. I'll stay with the cart, Esme said, handing the baby to Ruth without looking, muscle memory of friendship. People need the ritual of holding something warm. I'll take a tray to Mr. Ellis, Mrs. Pemberley declared, already ladling water like a general with a ladle instead of a sword. And a biscuit he's not supposed to like when he's faint. I'll speak to the council about keys and safety and how to make this official without making it crowded, Mavis added. If we need a rota, I can start one. If we need a rule, I'll write one that behaves. I'll read, Mr. Acker said, laying his hand over his book again, whether or not the bell rings in time with me. I can watch the little ones, a woman I didn't know offered, corralling 2 children with a gentle foot. And I, said Theo, can make a sign that says, "We're all right." He smiled a little, for us as much as for visitors. The square had been a chorus, now it was a plan. I felt something inside me slide into place, like a drawer that had always stuck now running easy on its track. I raised a hand for quiet and then laughed because quiet wasn't the right word. It was kindness I wanted. All right, I said. Jonah, you and Luca, the varsity kid supplied, ears pink. You and Luca, I said. Will you go with me? I can show you what Mr. Ellis showed me. We'll ring it together if that's all right with the town. A murmur of assent. It sounded like blessing. Ruth, I said, will you keep an eye on everything while we climb? If it goes wonky, shout a poem. She grinned. Always my first choice. Mrs. Pemberley, can I carry the tray? I asked. And she gave me a look that said both thank you and I knew you'd offer, and you should let me do my part. We'll do 2, she said, already setting out cups. 1 for Ellis, 1 for his stubborn shadow. We moved. That's the only way I can say it. No bustle, no frantic fixes, just movement that acknowledged what needed doing and did it with the hands present. Inside the town hall, the light in the corridor had a Wednesday flavor. I don't know how else to describe it. We took the narrow stair. Luca went first because youth has an understanding with small spaces. Jonah went second, one palm skimming the wall like he could read knots with his skin. I went last, my hand finding the greasy comfort of the rail. At the top, I pulled the cloth back, the same way I'd seen Mr. Ellis do, with a feeling in my chest like I was uncovering a sleeping cat. The bell waited, not impatient. I showed them the rope, the knot, the pulley that needed oil when the air went dry. First is the asking, I said, repeating Ellis's words. Second is the answer. It's less pull than conversation. Luca wrapped his hand and then, remembering Ellis's correction, unwrapped it. He took the rope as if it might read his heart. I nodded. He tugged. The bell lifted its voice and sent it down to the square. Even before the sound reached me from outside, I heard the outside gather it, the way a room gathers applause. He looked at me, startled and pleased in a single expression. "Again," I said, and his second pull was steadier, the bell's second note like a yes that had practiced. We rang 6 times, the spaces between not perfectly the way Ellis found them, but good, honest spaces. Like when you're learning the steps to a dance and the pleasure of getting close is better than the need to replicate. On the last one, I put my hand over Luca's on the rope. We pulled together, and a third hand, Jonah's, fell over ours. The bell sang so round and fine that for a second I forgot there had ever been any other kind of morning. "Good," Jonah said simply, and we did the tidy work. Cloth back over metal, rope smoothed, window checked. Downstairs we stopped by the little office. Mr. Ellis looked like he'd waged a small war with a blanket and lost in a satisfying way. His color had returned by a teaspoon. When he saw Jonah and Luca behind me, he sat a little straighter, pride doing what medication couldn't. "You heard," I said, because the question seemed silly. "I heard," he answered, and the smile that moved his mouth made me think of Mabel without needing to have met her. "You kept the spaces." "We can keep them again," I said, "and again, until you're back. And then after, too, if you want a morning off." He winced with gratitude. "I won't pretend I'll never give you the rope," he said, "but I'll argue about it first, for old time's sake." "I brought contraband," Mrs. Pemberley said from the doorway, balancing a tray with the ease of a woman who could carry fragile things across a shaking bridge. "Half strength, which means only half as good and twice as kind." He reached for the cup. Their eyes met and held the sort of conversation you don't put words on because words are clumsy some days. "You're not allowed to die until I say so," she told him bluntly, and he huffed a laugh that was also a cough. "Council business," Mavis announced, appearing in a frame of light. She waved a clipboard like a flag. "We'll need a list. Volunteers to be trained, 2 at a time. A key checkout that isn't fussy. Safety rails that meet code but don't make the stairs feel like jail. We'll do it slowly and right. The bell will stay itself. Agreed?" "Agreed," we said, and it felt like a covenant signed in tea. Back in the square, the difference between a morning without a bell and a morning with one was visible. Shoulders lowered, laughter came easier. The baby stopped making that tiny pre-crying face and went to sleep like being asleep was his job. Esme handed me a scone without looking, the way you feed a person you trust with your back turned. "You did it," she murmured. "We did it," I corrected, and meant it. I climbed the tea cart step again because my body had decided that was where it spoke best. "All right," I called. "Here's the plan for whoever wants it. Mavis will have a sign-up for people to be trained, 2 at a time up the stairs, so no one rings alone. Jonah and Luca will take the next 3 mornings with me. After that, we'll rotate. Pemberley is taking a tray to Mr. Ellis each day until he threatens to throw it at her, which is how we'll know he's better. If you don't want to climb but want to carry, come tell me. If you want to read, if you want to sweep, if you want to stand near the door and hold it open, if you want to refill the oil in the tin, if you want to write a poem about the first day the bell was late and we weren't. I stopped because my own words were making my eyes embarrass me. There's room, I finished. There's room for whatever you have. I saw it then, not as a metaphor or a line I might polish later, but as the shape of my belonging. The bell was a thread, the town was the cloth. My job, today, tomorrow, whenever, was to keep my hands clean and ready. Organizing this wasn't exposure or performance. It was housekeeping. It felt like lighting a kettle before someone came home from a long drive. The day unfolded around our new knowledge with the ease of a quilt laid over tired knees. Mavis taped a sheet to the side of the tea cart. Bellkeepers, names and mornings. People signed with small smiles like they were sending invitations to their future selves. Mr. Acker read a poem so gentle it felt like a hand on the back of your head. Jonah watered the geraniums with such obvious satisfaction you'd have thought he'd pulled the rain closer with a string. Theo painted a sign that said simply, "We are here," and propped it near the sycamore so visitors would know the silence had not been a symptom, just a story. At one point, I slipped away with a second tray, a thermos, a biscuit, a folded card with "For Mabel's rope" written inside. I left it outside Mr. Ellis's door and knocked once. He called thanks through the wood. The sound landed warm in my middle. Later, when the square had emptied to its regular, a woman I didn't know came up to me with the particular courage people borrow from afternoons. "I moved here last month," she said. "I've been waiting for, I don't know." She gestured at the air. "A knock, a name, a thing that says you belong if you wish." This morning felt like that. "Can I help?" I took her name for the list. "Show up," I said. "That's the whole theology." She laughed through her nose. Thank God. That night in my kitchen, I spread the sign-up list on the table and turned it into a rota with boxes and polite arrows. Mavis would have done it better, but I needed my hands to do the making. I drew hearts beside the days Luca had chosen because I am that sort of person. I put dots beside mornings when Jonah would be at the cemetery and needed a partner who wasn't squeamish about the quiet that lives near gravestones. I wrote my own name more than once. It felt less like volunteering and more like finding the place your own weight puts the least strain on the structure. I wrote a note for the bulletin board by the bread and book jar. The bell did not ring at 6 o'clock today. We did. Thank you for coming anyway still, and again tomorrow. C. I walked it down and pinned it with a thumbtack that had already held 3 other notices and still had one more in it. When I got home, I opened my notebook and wrote what I could bear to keep. The morning the bell fell silent, we found out the sound was not what gathered us. The wanting was. The wanting and the willingness to be seen wanting. Mr. Ellis was sick, and the town said, "Okay then." And we were ourselves in a new way that turned out to be the same old way, just revealed. I did not name him in what I wrote for anyone else. I kept his name in the part of my pages that is for living, not publishing. But I let the knowledge that a human being had climbed those stairs for years, quietly, set the tone for my own climbing. I would ring when asked. I would pour when needed. I would not explain the mystery out of existence. I would, when necessary, stand on a tea cart like a person who had earned a small platform and use it not to perform but to distribute work that felt like love. In the morning, the rhoda at the cart had 3 names under "Today." Luca and Jonah found me at the base of the stairs. We went up together, our breaths stitching a rhythm. The bell waited, patient as bread dough. We asked it. It answered. The note went out over Renford like the sound of a town deciding again, together, to begin. Back on the square, Mrs. Pemberley handed me a cup and tipped her head toward the town hall. "He heard it," she said. "I know," I said, and took a sip. Lemon and thyme, and something else I couldn't name. I didn't need to. Some flavors don't improve with knowing. You just drink them and call it morning and carry on. The first morning the rhoda hung beside the tea cart, it looked like a quilt. Names in different inks, small hearts, accidental smudges, a coffee ring near Thursday because Theo has never mastered lids. Mavis had tacked it up with the satisfaction of a librarian labeling a new shelf, and people kept drifting over to run a finger down their own square like you do over a scar that's healed. The mystery had softened into a practice. No one pretended otherwise now. We knew that someone climbed those tight stairs with the good creak and the smell of old wood and rope, and we knew there was oil in a tin and a cloth folded just so, and we knew hands warmed the bell before it warmed us. It should have ruined something. By all the rules of romance, naming the mechanism dissolves the spell, but it didn't. If anything, the magic widened to include our legs and lungs and the relief on our faces when we made the sound together. On Tuesdays, Jonah rang with whoever was learning to listen for spaces. On Fridays, Esme left the basket with Ruth and climbed in her soft-soled shoes, laughing about how she'd never thought stairs could feel like a hymn. Saturdays belonged to the teenagers. Luca found a friend named Amari who had the kind of patience that makes team captains jealous, and they would come down grinning, not for attention, but because they'd made a sound that landed on toddlers and old men and everyone in between. I took Wednesdays as mine, though I never climbed alone. Sometimes I went up with Mavis, who liked to rest her palm on the bell between pulls the way you might on a kitchen table you love. Sometimes with Mr. Acker, who counted the spaces by lines, murmuring now under his breath on what would have been the caesura. Sometimes I went with Mrs. Pemberley, who would say, "We'll have tea waiting for us," as if that fact would coax gravity to behave on the downward trip. The ritual grew muscle. There were mornings, rare but real, when the bell didn't need to be rung because rain on the roofs was doing a perfectly adequate job of speaking for the day, or because fog had thickened into something like wool, and we settled for the scraping sound of chair legs and the hush of shared breathing. But most mornings we kept the time. People showed up a little earlier, not to get a better seat, but to help. Someone swept. Someone refilled sugar and washed mugs when they left theirs behind by accident or design. It turns out certain people like to know their favorite cup will be waiting for them the next day. Someone set out a plate with a note taped to it that said, "Take a scone if you argued with sleep." We learned a new kind of applause. It wasn't clapping exactly. That always felt wrong here. Too sharp for a square where even laughter tended to come with round edges. It was more a collective humming, low, content, that met the last chime and stretched it a breath longer. The bell had always felt like a call. Now it felt also like a chorus. I started writing the way rain starts, gradually, then decisively. The folder labeled Renford Mornings gained cousins, kinds of quiet, things that ring, the work people don't name. I took my notebook everywhere on purpose, but not with the old hunger. I wanted to be available to what the day offered. Some mornings a sentence would arrive whole, like a scone I hadn't paid for. The bell is a permission slip passed in every direction, and I'd tuck it on the page to keep it from getting cold. Other days I would go home with nothing but the imprint of the kettle handle on my palm, and wake at midnight with a line sitting politely at the edge of my bed, waiting to be invited onto paper. I wrote about the first note of the bell and the look people get in their shoulders when they hear it, like a bird folding itself mid-flight and remembering it has another way to move. I wrote about the way the square smells different on different days, cinnamon and old leaves and book glue and wool. I wrote about Mr. Acker's habit of patting his book after he finished the morning poem, and Ruth's habit of tapping the sycamore with 2 fingers as she passed, and the way the bread and book jar acquired a thick nest of index cards that sometimes slid to the floor with a sigh, and how there was always someone there to catch them. What surprised me wasn't that I could write again, but that I wanted to write about small things and didn't feel like I was failing at ambition. The city had trained me to believe that scale equals seriousness. Big problems, big arguments, big ideas, big platforms. Renford has taught me that a bell rung by hand in a town square can be a thesis on what a human life is for, and that if I write it with the right kind of attention, I am not reducing the world. I am enlarging it by the size of my love. The essays became letters, is what I mean, even when I didn't address them to anyone. I wrote one called 6 o'clock as a verb, about how the bell doesn't just tell time, it acts, and in acting it invites us to act. I wrote one called Tenderness Has a Schedule, which made me laugh at my own pretension and then cry because I love being teased by myself almost as much as I love being teased by Ruth. I wrote one half in the voice of the bell and then, worried I'd anthropomorphized a piece of metal into lying on my behalf, rewrote it in the voice of the person who polished it every month with an old t-shirt because they were the one with a mouth. When I had 5 of them that didn't embarrass me, I printed them and brought them to Bread and Book. I didn't make a fuss. I tucked them into a little basket with a sign that read, "Morning reading. Take one, return if you remember." People did. They told me in their sideways ways. "You write like a person who likes butter," Theo said, which is the best review I have ever received. "You made my Tuesday feel smaller and somehow more important," Mavis said, which I copied into my notebook because it's what I want for every day of my life. I read the one about the fog to my sister on the phone, Esme told me, swaying the baby like punctuation. And she cried in the traffic and didn't hit anyone, so I think that's a good outcome. We decided, not all at once, not in council, just in that Renford way where a thing becomes true slowly and then is suddenly obvious, that once a month the bell would ring from the square. Someone, usually Jonah, sometimes a child appointed by the day, would stand in the middle and lift a hand and bring it down in a gentle arc, and somewhere above us, from the tower, the bell would answer. It was a call and response that made new nerve endings in places I didn't know had space for them. The first time we did it, the cadence was off, and we laughed and tried again, and afterwards someone tucked a card in the jar that said, "We rang the town and the town rang back," and I wish I'd written it, but I didn't, which is perfect. There were glitches. Of course there were. A Tuesday in June when the rope snagged and we had to sing instead, which we did poorly and with such savage joy that no one minded. A Thursday where 3 tourists with expensive cameras tried to stage photos of a quaint morning, and Mrs. Pemberley handed them mugs and refused to pour until they put the cameras away. Which they did, bewildered but hydrated. A Saturday when the teenagers ran the bell too fast because excitement is a kind of rhythm, and afterward Mr. Ellis wrote, "Space is part of sound," on the rhoda, and we pretended not to notice we were all trying not to cry. Yes, Mr. Ellis. He got better. Not entirely. Not back to the kind of body that lets you forget you live in one. But enough. He came out late one morning in a sweater that fit differently, head bare, eyes clear in that way they are when a person has been somewhere alone and come back to tell the story in one-word sentences. We were already gathered. The bell had rung, timed by Jonas and Mio. a new volunteer with the gentlest hands and a laugh. You could hear her laugh in the bell if you listened. The square saw him the way a shoreline sees the return of a tide. "Ellis!" someone called, and then regretted the volume because tenderness here likes to arrive with a soft knock. But the shout broke something good open. People clapped. Not our usual hum, but a real clap, sharp enough to skip across the cobbles. He winced and grinned and waved it smaller. "All right," he said, which is what a man says when he's close to tears and sees no dignity in fighting them in front of his neighbors. He sat on the chair Ruth had dragged to exactly the right patch of sun, and we did not press in. We made a little ring of space around him so he could breathe the way he likes, with the square in his lungs. The bell rang again, a late chime we hadn't expected, courtesy of the teenagers playing with echo. And he let out a sound I will not try to write because my words do not know how to stand next to certain kinds of gratitude. Mrs. Pemberley brought him tea and a biscuit he was not supposed to have, and everyone agreed not to see either. Mavis held up a little paper cup like a toast, and it was so clearly the right thing that it spread, a slow wave of lifted mugs. "To Mr. Ellis," she said, and then, because she is careful to name the larger thing, "and to Mabel, and to hands that don't ask to be thanked before they do their work." "To the bell," Jonah added, "and to the spaces. To the days we begin on purpose," came from somewhere I didn't catch. I lifted my mug too. "To keeping time together," I said, because I had finally learned to make a sentence that didn't owe anything to cleverness to be true. We sipped. It tasted like lemon, like thyme, like whatever it is you put in tea that convinces the day you are willing to meet it. Mr. Acker read a poem he'd been saving for something like this. A poem that had the line, "We love each other in the small ways so that the big ways will know where to land, and if that isn't a map, I don't know what is." After, people went about their daily business with a particular kind of lightness. Again, not relief exactly, more like recognition. I watched Mr. Ellis watch us. He saw a teenager take out the trash from the bakery without being asked. He saw Theo hammer a crooked nail on the back of the bench he'd been meaning to fix for months. He saw a woman I didn't know kneel to tie a stranger's shoe because the stranger's hands were full of toddler. He saw, and he put his hand over his heart and kept it there, steadying whatever it steadied. For the first time in decades, the bell had rung without him, and the town was exactly as he and Mabel had hoped it would be, gathered by sound but held by choice. That night, I wrote an essay called "The Morning Bell Lives On." It begins like this. There are sounds we think we'll be listening for the rest of our lives. Someone's laugh, a door that tells you home, a song that remembers your hands. When those sounds stop even for a day, the world feels tilted. And then the world tilts again to right itself, because the sound was never the point. The wanting was. the wanting and the way we made one another brave enough to answer. I put that at the top, and then let myself tell the story the way it wants to be told. Elbows on a table in the kitchen at 10 p.m., with a kettle cooling next to the sink and the square breathing in my bones like a cat on my chest. The essays began to take on their own small life. Someone stapled my third one to the community board, and it acquired pen marks like a palimpsest. Yes! And my grandfather used to ring the noon whistle at the factory. This made me remember him. And please write about the nights, too. I put up a little sign by the basket that said, "If you read one, tell me what it tasted like to you." And underneath, people began to leave words. Toast with honey, the green smell when you first open a book, standing on the porch in a storm. I copied these into my notebook. My notebook is greedy, but without ill intent. I also started sending the essays to places that might pay me to be this exact person, and a funny thing happened. I did not contort my sentences to please an imagined editor. I told the truth as I understood it, and I kept the names that shouldn't travel tucked in the part of my pages that is only for me. And some magazines said no, and some said yes, and every time I put the kettle on regardless. It turns out that when you live your ambition at the size of your own heart instead of the size of a city skyline, rejection is a weather report, not a catastrophe. I wrote one more essay that I knew I would not publish anywhere but here. I called it What We Owe Quiet. It was for Mr. Ellis and for Mabel and for the rope, and for anyone who had ever done a thing every day because they could, and because it kept someone else alive. I printed it and gave it to him folded into fourths like a childhood note. He read it on the bench by the geraniums and smiled in the way that makes a person look briefly like they did in their wedding photo, even if you've never seen it. "You did not ruin anything by knowing," he said to me. "Some people ruin things by knowing. You did not." "I almost did," I admitted. And then the town reminded me how to hold information like a cup and not a megaphone. "Good," he said. "Keep doing that." We went on. That's the thing I want to tell you in the end. Not that Renford became perfect because we named our bell ringers. Not that the square never saw a morning when anger arrived before sugar or grief had to sit on the stone wall with a head between its knees before it could hear a poem. We went on. The rota filled, the tin got refilled. The bell's lip went on softening from hands. And some days were ordinary in the dreary sense, and some were ordinary in the holy sense, and most were both. The bell rang, and babies fell asleep, and teenagers looked ashamed for 2 minutes, and then remembered they were good and laughed, and widowers held their mugs like ropes, and strollers squeaked until someone found oil. And the sycamore grew new leaves in a way so unsurprising it nearly knocked me over. This morning, for example, it is the kind of morning that makes you believe in coins found on sidewalks. The sun has chosen not to be stingy. The light lays itself in long gold on the cobbles the way a cat lays across your keyboard. I'm on the T-cart step because I have unofficially become the person who reads names off the rota when nerves make hands shake. Today, I call, we have Luca. Cheers from his friends who pretend not to be proud. And Mavis, a delighted murmur. And anyone who wants to hold the door open for them as they go up. Half the square moves. We are not efficient. We are exactly on time. The bell rings. The first note climbs the air and leans on the cornices and drops into mugs and pauses on the backs of knuckles. The second note answers, and for a second I hear, clearly enough to put down on paper later, the echo of a woman I never met, and the low yes of her husband from a stairwell years ago. I think about how a ritual is just a habit that got brave enough to love more than one person. Mr. Ellis is here, on the chair with the good sun. He lifts his cup when the bell speaks, not as if to toast, not exactly, but as if to say, I hear you. He doesn't cry today. He did yesterday. He might tomorrow. That's the good of time. It keeps giving you another chance to be human. We toast him anyway, with a hum, with mugs, with silence. To the keeper who made it ours, someone says, and I don't turn around to see who because it doesn't matter. To the town that keeps it, someone else adds. Esme's baby, no longer truly a baby, babbles in agreement and hands a scone to a dog who does not deserve it and receives it anyway because Grace is sloppy sometimes. I take a sip. Lemon and thyme, yes, and a little something extra that Mabel would have liked. The sunlight lifts itself a bit higher on the brick, and Mr. Acker opens his book, and the day does what it will with what we give it. I have an essay in my bag, half finished, called The Sound That Holds Us, and I know how it ends now. With this cup, with this bell, with this square, with this laughter, with this man in a sweater he's decided to claim, with this boy who will someday tell someone younger how to leave space between notes. With me, in the middle of a life I finally recognize as mine. The bell rings a last time, and the echo hangs just long enough to make a choice possible. We make it. We begin. And in the gold of the morning, the town looks less like a place on a map and more like a sentence we write together. Every chime a comma, every sip a word. Every face the kind of punctuation that doesn't end things so much as make room for what comes next. I stand with my neighbors, who are now a kind of family, and I let the sound thread me to them to me, and I think, this is enough. This is more than enough. This is a bell rung by hands, and it is magic. And that ends tonight's meditation. You're welcome to stay for a bit longer if you like. Have a beautiful night until next time.